So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Cathy Willis. I'm the principal here at Teddy Hall, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all to the Emden lecture. So this is St Eben Hall's annual history lecture, endowed in the name of one of my predecessors, A.B. Emden. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Stella Ghervas, who will be delivering this year's lecture. So many of you may already know Stella is a professor of Russian history at Newcastle University, and she's been working on subjects that unfortunately are of enormous importance in these somewhat turbulent times: the history of peace and peacemaking, and the intellectual history of Russia, and the history of the Black Sea region, especially Ukraine. So Stella did her first degree in Leningrad, as it was then, and since then has held teaching, research and visiting positions in Australia, France, Georgia, Moldova, Romania, Russia, Switzerland, Ukraine, Britain and the United States. So I'm amazed you have time to write books as well, I have to say. Fantastic. But she is the author or editor of 6 books, including Reinventing Tradition, Alexandru Sturza, and the Europe of the Holy Alliance, and A Cultural History of Peace in the Age of Enlightenment, which is co-edited with David Armitage, who's with us here this evening. So her most recent book is Conquering Peace, From the Enlightenment to the European Union, which was a sweeping history of the European peacemaking across the centuries, and it's been shortlisted for the 2023 Laura Shannon Prize in European Studies, and has received really glowing reviews already, most notably by Perry Anderson in the London Review of Books. So Stella's currently working on a new project more directly related to Ukraine and its environs, called Calming the Waters, a new history of the Black Sea. But today she's going to return to the themes of her recent book, and her title is Conquering Peace in Tempore Belli, Post-War Europe in Long-Range Perspective. Stella.
Thank you very much, Professor Willis, and for these extraordinarily kind words. I am happy and honored by your invitation to stand here at Teddy Hall. And I would like, of course, to thank the principal of the college and also the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present the 2022 Emden lecture. How intimidating it is to follow Quentin Skinner, John Eliot, Mark Mazawa, and Linda Roper in giving this distinguished lecture. Talking about peace is challenging enough in normal times. But they are not normal times. In 2022, we have again an open war on the continent between Russia and Ukraine for the first time since the Balkan Wars of 1990s. Is it even possible to talk about peace in Europe in tempore belli? So to answer that question, it is an exercise in applied history. And how should we talk about peace in time of war? I will provide you a clue from the start. The answer depends on the time frame, whether we are thinking in terms of weeks, months, years, or decades. As a historian, I was led to look at events sub specie eternitatis, which literally means under the aspect of eternity. This is, of course, a figure of speech. More modestly, I'm looking at this question from the viewpoint of the longue durée. That is, 3 centuries of European past. And indeed, since we are lacking the necessary critical distance from the current events, I will illustrate the various facets of this question using the collective experience of Europe since the early 18th century. This is the subject of my book, Conquering Peace from the Enlightenment to the European Union, published last year by Harvard University Press. And here is my plug. You'll find flyers of the book at the entrance with a 30% discount for the holiday season. So the story I recounted was how, after the guns have fallen silent, diplomats and state leaders have managed to rebuild new political orders and sometimes new civilization from the rubble. And that's what I call conquering peace. I wanted to write a historical fresco of peace and peacemaking with a broad scope, not just in time, but also in space, from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains, and from the North Cape in Norway to the Strait of Sicily. This perspective I call enlarged Europe, and that also includes Russia and a historical Constantinople, or Turkey today. I will present 3 arguments of why it is still necessary to speak about peace in time of war. First, war and peace belong to the same continuum of reality. Secondly, war is nothing but a judicial duel fought to determine the future peace. And thirdly, war is an illness that needs to be cured, while lasting peace is a state of health. To address those points, I will use the same vocabulary and grammar of peace used by philosophers of the Enlightenment, later by the Peacemakers at the Congress of Vienna in 1814-15, and as well as by those of 20th century. To go forward, it is often a sound idea to look backwards. In Conquering Peace, I refer particularly to the aftermath of 5 great wars in Europe. The first is the War of the Spanish Succession, caused by the bid of the French king, Louis XIV, in the early 18th century for his bid for European hegemony. The second is the Napoleonic Wars and the French Empire, 1 century later, in early 19th century. Then the First World War and the Second German Reich, the Second World War and the Third Reich, and finally the Cold War and the Soviet hegemony over half of Europe. I did not select those 5 episodes randomly. Indeed, they are connected by a definite pattern. A real, immediate threat of being conquered by European pan-continental empire. By France twice, with Louis XIV's union of France and Spain, then Napoleon and his French Empire. By Germany twice, the Second Reich under the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the Third Reich under Hitler, and under the Soviet Union in the Cold War, once, by Russia once. Then an immense war that precipitated Europe into complete political and economic chaos. And most importantly, A complete new political order of the continent had to be designed and built out of the rubble. On each occasion, the diplomats of the victorious powers displaced military leaders at the end of each great European war. Let us dive headfirst into our subject, to the fact that war and peace belong to the same continuum of reality. After all, how did these 5 great European wars start? With some political dream of self-aggrandizement at the expense of neighbors, complete with a caricatural slogan, it will be over by Christmas, everything will be over by Christmas. And this is a recurring phenomenon in all of our episodes. And there is also, paradoxically, a risk inherent to having had lasting peace in Western Europe, as we had since 1945. And that is amnesia. Amnesia of past wars. As decades go by, there are less and less people left alive who remember what it meant to live in a country collectively fighting a large-scale war. But then changes of generation occur. The bad memories tend to be forgotten, and military adventurism goes back into fashion. And that phenomenon was obvious after, to give an example, after 1848, after the spring, the so-called Spring of Nations, the revolutions of 1848, when a new generation of political leaders came to power in Britain and France who had not known the Napoleonic Wars. And this may shed light on the Crimean War at the mid of the 19th century, by which I mean the rather pointless siege of Sebastopol. And the current war in that region is a recent descendant of that episode. One does not engage light-heartedly a whole country into the business of a large-scale war. Besides the human casualties and the destruction, it's an immense drain on a country's economy and may compromise its long-term health and survival. For all that, it would be irrational to argue that Ukraine in 2022, as was the case, for example, for France in 1940, should have laid down its weapons, and the population should have welcomed an occupation army with open arms, especially one sent by a tyrannical regime. And for that reason, we are witnessing today in Ukraine the same phenomenon that regularly occurred in times of war. Seeking peace becomes identified with the refusal to fight. That leads us to the crux of our disturbing question. Does a genuine desire and the pursuit of peace necessarily lead to an absolute rejection of military force and the war in all its forms? The answer is no, and this it is easily proved. Indeed, how did each of those 5 great wars stop? One fights for war aims. Those aims are in themselves a certain idea of peace after the war. Furthermore, after several years and uncountable casualties and people displaced, not to mention war atrocities, the belligerents start considering that humanity would much be happier if it finally dispensed with the misery of war. Indeed, the 5 episodes I have just mentioned are all at the tail end of murderous continental wars. And it is interesting to note, emphatically, that the effort at lasting peace was made by the same states that had fought the war. The leaders of wartime and the peacemakers were generally the same individuals. I wish to repeat this essential notion. Those who sought peace were the same who had successfully fought the war. Peacemaking in each of those 5 episodes was thus not a denial of the war, but the best way to reap the benefits of the war and to ensure peace in the future. It is as simple as that. The war that just ended was a strenuous effort, and it should not go to waste. There is a desire to collect the peace dividends on it. As a side note, I am speaking about peacemaking, or what the French call l'art de la paix, the art of peace. I'm not talking here about pacifism. Before making peace after war, in each of these episodes, it was necessary to win first that war, or at least to force the other party to the negotiation table. The motivation for concluding peace was not non-violence, as in make love and peace. This takes us to the word P word, pacifism, which is a polysemic word. It has multiple meanings. And if you are following the news today, it got really recently even a negative connotation, the word pacifism, in relation to the war on Ukraine. Pacifism is in general usage identified with the rejection of violence or a refusal to participate in military action. Yet, starting from that concept of non-violence, to approach the European tradition of peace would lead to misconceptions about history. This is an idea carried in particular by the benevolent Christian teaching of Matthew. You know, everyone knows that. Do not resist an evil person. So if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. The Quakers, for example, set a remarkable example as promoters of non-violence. But in truth, non-violence was never accepted as a maxim of good politics over the last 2 millennia, much less in the last 3 centuries. It has always been unsuitable for the customs of politics as practiced in Europe. We could, however, give another meaning to pacifism as applied today to international relations. And that it's the doctrine according to which disputes among states, among nations, should be settled peacefully as much as possible. And for this, Martin Siedel used the word pacificism, precisely to avoid the confusion with non-violence. In all fairness, some dictionaries in English or in French or in German I consulted do acknowledge pacifism in that sense I just described. Others emphasize the non-violence. Very few dictionaries give both senses, both meanings of the word pacifism. I made this distinction between peacemaking and non-violence to emphasize that the European tradition of peace, which then evolved into international law, never ruled out war. It only affirms that negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or a judicial court are all preferable to war and should be used to avoid it. Indeed, all of the thinkers of the so-called tradition of perpetual peace, chief of which Abbé de Saint-Pierre, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Kant in the 18th century, observed that the existence of war as a matter of course, and did not consider a categorical prohibition of making war. They did not consider war immoral per se. What was immoral was to use military violence for self-aggrandizement, or when peaceful means are still available to settle the dispute. They had not assumed that such peaceful means were always available, especially when one was facing an invasion army. That leads us to a very important notion, which is the function of war in European history. I issue the following caution. It may not be what you think. Here is a very down-to-earth preliminary observation, which I made in my book and which is applicable to any century of modern European history. To quote the theoretician of war, von Clausewitz, following Grotius on this, war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. There is a deep belief in the legitimacy of war within definite limits that may be put in perspective with the immemorial tribal customs of Germanic Empire, when the purpose of a private judicial duel, also known as a trial by battle or wager by combat, as it used to be named in England, was to determine which party is right and which is wrong. Evidently, the Lord gives victory to his anointed. Similarly, in a war between sovereign states, the victorious power gains the right to write and enforce the clauses in the post-war settlement treaty, as in Vienna in 1815, Paris in 1919, etc. Those clauses of the peace treaty, particularly of a territorial and economic nature, determined the new legal status quo. What would thereafter be considered right and wrong? Also, the victorious power gains the right to impose its own historical narrative of the events. And that narrative was, of course, slanted in the direction of explaining why that victory in war represented the triumph of good against evil. It follows as a corollary of the definition of war as a judicial duel, that a just war is nothing but the war won by the victorious power, by force of arms. Conversely, the defeated power was in the wrong. That results from the nature of war. This pragmatic definition clashes with the legally accepted definitions of just war and crime of aggression. But this fact is obvious in the episodes I explored. Just to give an example, of the clash between the international legal system and practical sense taken from the 20th century, the Soviet Union exerted military hegemony on Eastern Europe between 1945 to 1989. We know that the USSR had soundly defeated the Third Reich in the Second World War. As a result, it had obtained a privileged position as a member of the United Nations Security Council. International law firmly condemned the violation of state sovereignties. Yet, since the UN Assembly could not validly pass judgment on the USSR because of it, it was dead letter for all practical purposes. This was the root cause of the Cold War's deadlock. The takeaway is that the notion of just war, in actual fact, it is not based on conformity to legal principles or morality. It's not based on, but on the force of arms. In a contest of arguments between a pointed gun and a book of law, the gun always has the last word. And that conclusion is certainly not very encouraging. There is, however, another way of looking at war and peace. One big idea that I cover in my book, Conquering Peace, is that the global community cannot be treated as a machine or a random collection of pieces, but as a whole, as a living organism. Each state as an organ or a cell. This organic metaphor is not new at all. It was only forgotten during the age of steel machinery. Yet it can be found in the French Encyclopédie, or Diderot's Encyclopédie of the 18th century. And it was part of the entry on peace by the French scholar Étienne Noël d'Amilaville, which is revealingly more about war than about peace. It says, the war is a convulsive and violent disease of the body politic. Or in modern terms, of the international community. And indeed, several authors, like Hobbes, had said that peace has to be invented against the natural condition of humanity, which is war. And here, Damilaville made a strong correction. He said, yes, war had been part of the human condition. But stating that war should be a natural condition of humanity is a misconception, in the same way as stating that illness should be the normal condition of the human body. There is inherently good and bad conditions in life. War is a disease of the international community. This metaphor helps us answer the question of war. Several writers, starting from Abbé de Saint-Pierre, wrote that the role of peacemakers has been to be the medical doctors of our societies. Yet, the condition of the patient, if not treated preventively, may have become so bad that the cure would be to use with a potent drug, a defensive war. Simply said, if you are caught in a war, you have to win it. Hence, war against Napoleon became a necessity for Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia to ally in order to restore the balance of power. And that meant putting together a military coalition to prevent an empire from overwhelming all of Europe. A balance of power, however, is a tool to win a war, not to maintain peace, not to maintain the peace or to reestablish the peace. There was much talk about it over the centuries, about this political concept, the balance of power as a principle in order to reestablish peace after a great war and to maintain peace. Notably, you can give the example, of course, of the confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Saint Pierre had written in his plan for perpetual peace of 1713 that a European configuration of states where two military alliances would oppose each other would never be in a state of peace, would never be in a state of true, what he called a true peace. On the contrary, it would always be at best in a state of what he called an armed truce. And the risk would always be present that those two opposed coalitions would restart the vicious cycle of an arms race, which might then degenerate into another war, destruction and general impoverishment. Saint Pierre thus called the balance of power a state of war. And that would be an unhealthy condition of the political body, of the international community. The current events in Ukraine are a case in point to demonstrate that a long-term situation of the so-called balance of power between Russia and its neighbors eventually led to war, not peace. And indeed, it is well-known maxim that an ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure. If a country, as Ukraine, has reached the fateful moment when Hannibal is at the gates and preparations must be made to fight a bloody siege, it is likely because Europe failed to apply the proper prophylaxis. That was, in any case, the Churchill's views on the errors that led to the rise of the Third Reich's terrifying military power, as this quote from his speech in the House of Commons on 22nd of February 1938. A firm stand by France and Britain with other powers associated with them at that time and with the authority of the League of Nations would have been followed by the immediate German evacuation of the Rhineland without the shedding of a drop of blood. And the effects of that might have been blessed beyond all compare because it would have enabled the more prudent elements of the German army to gain their proper position and would not have given to the political head of Germany the enormous ascendancy which has enabled him to move forward, end quote. By contrast, preventive war can be irrational, just as it would be irrational to inoculate a convulsive disease to a sane patient in order to prevent that same disease. It helps explain the rationale of the 2016 report of the Chilwell Inquiry on the Iraq War of 2004, which concluded that the case for war had been deficient, since there had still a way for peaceful negotiation. My aim is not to judge any specific case in one way or another, since we are still lacking historical distance, but to insist on this fine point that war and peace do exist on the same plane of reality, and that peace can be only reached by acknowledging the existence of war and understanding its dual essence, both as a dual and as a disease. So, what would be peace? This ideal state of health of the international community that we are looking for. During the Enlightenment era, philosophers spoke of pax perpetua, or perpetual peace. Of course, peace was never eternal. As Immanuel Kant, following Leibniz, dryly noted that the only truly eternal peace was the peace of the graveyard. Today, we would use the phrase lasting peace. And in fact, this term was adopted in the diplomatic speech during the 20th century. What we truly mean by lasting peace is a situation where there is a relatively harmonious interrelation among states or within a community. Trust, trade, free circulation of people, goods, and ideas. That would be a state of good health of the international community, a state of peace, to use the terms of the 18th century. Saint Pierre proposed what he termed a system of peace, a federation of states that would guarantee the status quo of borders, complete with a court of justice. He used for this federation of states the term of European society, or even the literal term of the European Union, Union Européenne, and that was in 1713, avant la lettre. Later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau elaborated on the model of Saint Pierre to make it more accessible. But he also noted that the princes of Europe would be too greedy, jealous, and ambitious to accept such conditions for a system of peace and to found a federation of European states. Immanuel Kant later made a remarkable synthesis in his sketch Zum ewigen Frieden, toward perpetual peace. The problem with Saint Pierre's plan of European federation is obvious. There was a considerable gap between theory and practice, between his ideas and the reality. Many, notably Leibniz and Rousseau, asked a key question. Why would greedy kings, European monarchs, would agree to reduce their ambitions and to become part of a federation? It seemed impossible at the time, and it was called an utopia. And yet, this ideal did make its way up to the minds of kings and heads of states, who toyed with it cautiously, in the manner of cats. But how to bridge this theory and practice? How to bridge these ideals, this reflection on war and peace with the reality? And each of the 5 post-war episodes I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, key moments of European history, was a moment in the advancement of what I call the engineering of peace. These experiments were conducted at the end of each great continental war. The term engineering implies that each new peace spirit built on the previous experience to achieve the same goal, lasting peace. So let's make a list of those, very briefly, of those advances in the 5 episodes. The first, the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, located in that city in the Netherlands. It brought the principle of coexistence between European states called the balance of power. So this principle of the balance of power was literally inserted into the Peace Treaty of Utrecht for the very first time in a legal document. And this principle of coexistence between European states, the balance of power, was the constitution of grand alliances as a tool to defeat any European superpower that would threaten the overwhelm of Europe. So this principle of the balance of power came as a political principle, not just to reestablish peace after a great war, but was considered at the time also as a tool in order to maintain peace in Europe. And this moment was indeed the first light of the so-called spirit of Enlightenment, Abbé de Saint-Pierre and Rousseau firmly put a European Union on the map with their plans of perpetual peace, at least on an imaginary map at the time. 1 century later, the treaties of 1814-15 and the birth of the so-called Congress system, which acted as a board of directors for the continent. Of course, not to mention the Treaty of the Holy Alliance of 1815, which had a fundamentally important and counterintuitive political consequence, which changed forever the way the great powers conceived the European order. Let's not forget that all the negotiators at the Congress of Vienna, including the Tsar, Alexander I, or Metternich, were minds of the late Enlightenment. How these people came to embody the reaction, the so-called reaction after during the Vienna settlement, in opposition to everything that we think today as enlightened, that's an interesting question. Read the book. About the Treaty of the Versailles after World War I, I break, like several other historians, from the traditional narrative of Carthaginian peace. It would be closer to the truth to say that the Paris Conference of 1919 was a comprehensively messed up affair without a general plan, and in fact without allies, since victorious powers had not even agreed on their war aims. But at least one big idea came out of it. What it was called at the time a machinery of peace, called the League of Nations, a lineal ancestor of the United Nations. After the World War II, the European construction in the early 1950s and the first European communities and the fantastic breakthrough, the so-called functionalism. As French statesman Robert Schuman wrote, I quote, "Europe will not be made all at once. or according to a single plan. He was throwing all the early peace plans out of the window. Europe will be built through concrete achievements, which first create a de facto solidarity, end quote. And that was the magic formula. Little by little, step by step, in keeping and maintaining peace. The fifth and last episode, which started in 1989, also embraced Central and Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on. It defined the reunification of Germany, the establishment of the European Union in 1992, and the enlargement of the EU to the east. This process shows that the aim of peace fostered the political idea of Europe over the centuries, long before the EU, and even before the age of nation-states. Seen in that enlarged perspective, the European Union is merely the latest and possibly not even the last of attempts to achieve the idea of Europe as a space of political peace. To conclude tonight's lecture, let me propose a few considerations on the current war. The apparent good entente between the EU and Russia of the early 1990s turned into open war in Ukraine. That country, being aggressed and invaded, has apparently little choice but to accept the duel and do its utmost to win that war. Peace is for the strong, war is for the weak, meaning that the country, Russia or Ukraine, that wins the war will also gain the right to define the post-war order. Therefore, if we wish to preserve the current status quo of legality, it would be better that those who are in the right legally, that is Ukraine, are also the winners of the judicial duel of war. Otherwise, there will be an unfavorable settlement and legality will be redefined in favor of Russia, in the same way that it was redefined for the Soviet Union after the Second World War. What I am arguing is that everyone seems to focus their attention today on the combat battlefield. Yet, peace will have to be restored sooner or later. And a country that fights a war just for the sake of war would lose sight of its war aims, namely what lasting peace want to establish after the war. If it was not preparing for it in time of war, it would throw away its current war effort. Furthermore, as a result of the war in Ukraine, the question of a European common army is again in discussion today in the European Union, albeit in a degraded form. It is not surprising, since the purpose now is a traditional one: to set up a military alliance on the continent to restore the balance of power against the Federation of Russia. The notion of a pan-European coalition is nothing new, since it happened at the time of the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century, during the Napoleonic Wars against France, and during World War I and World War II against Germany. And supposing all is well and the war ends favorably for Ukraine, in 1946, Winston Churchill astonished the public of the University of Zurich in Switzerland by stating that there should be a reconciliation between Germany and France. I hope that I will not astonish you if I say they all have to be, at some point, a reconciliation between Russia and the neighboring states, as well between Russia and the United States. The opportunity to really make peace in the early 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, was not seized. And now we have war again. And now we have a situation that has festered for a sufficiently long time, that the Kremlin committed a crime of aggression. I hope that this time the great powers will have learned their lesson and settle matters so that we do not start again the same spiral of violence within 20 or 30 years. And the engineering of peace has simply been, to use Leo Tolstoy's words, as an effort to sail on this storm-tossed sea of history toward the aim of a Europe without wars. In other words, to solve that war, as well as the many frozen conflicts in Europe and its neighborhoods, and to avert as much as possible the outbreak of the next great war, no more, no less. We could, for example, imagine a multilateral treaty for the settlement of the Black Sea region. The current war demonstrates that there was never any manifest destiny on this continent. After winning a war, establishing a new order that will guarantee lasting peace is an act of courage, which I dare say goes beyond heroism in battle. Hence, here are my last words. Peace is for the strong, war is for the weak. Thank you.